I'm Michelle Lou Carriger. I was the chair of the ATHE 2022 Outstanding Article Award Committee, and I am so thrilled to be interviewing the winner of the 2022 ATHE Outstanding Article Award, Nikki Yeboah, for the article, All the Nations a Stage, the Ghana National Theater as Sankofa Praxis. I'm going to ask about that in this interview. So I just have a few questions. I'm so excited to learn more about this article. We were all super thrilled to learn about all of this and to get to honor your work and hopefully share it with lots more people.
Yeah, I hope too.
So the first question is, how did you come across this topic? How does it fit into your overall research profile?
So I came across this topic first when I was writing my dissertation. My field site was in Ghana, and at first I was just going to do like oral histories of Ghanaians. I didn't quite know what the subject matter would be, but I knew that that's what I wanted it to be. Was I'm going to go back to my country, a country that I left when I was 6 years old, and so I have kind of tenuous ties to, and kind of recover myself through the practice of doing this dissertation. As I became increasingly self-reflexive, I realized what I was doing was Sankofa. And I realized that it wasn't just me that did it. It was a common practice that Black people, whether or not they're from the continent and estranged from it, like I am, or descendants of slavery and have like a longer kind of history of being denied access to the continent. Sojourning, I guess, to Ghana was one of the ways in which we could kind of practice an act of recovery, of cultural recovery, cultural memory and retrieval. And so my dissertation then became about that. And each chapter was a case study of how it was being done. So this chapter kind of kickstarted it all off, because in writing it, I realized that even Ghanaians that were on the continent and kind of trying to shape what the nation was, even they felt a sense of estrangement from it. Middle and upper class Ghanaians of the 50s, as they were seeking to form a sense of national identity, started to wonder, what is that? What does our culture look like in a colonial, increasingly post-colonial world? And so the National Theater is a wonderful site for thinking about how they kind of worked or negotiated their own concerns, their own insecurities, and their own questions around what cultural identity looks like for them.
Yeah, the committee really agreed. What we loved was, instead of thinking about stuff that was maybe happening on a stage, which is very typical for us in theater studies, we were talking about the stage, right? And how it is constructed and how that itself sort of carries out multiple performative meanings, I guess, if you will. So the next question is, again, about Sankofa. So we really appreciated, this was a term that many of us had heard before, but we have sort of a very superficial, kind of a one sentence notion of what that might mean. And so we really appreciated that it was used quite expansively and sort of complexly in your article, and that was super inspiring to people. And one thing in particular that comes out in the article is expanding the notion of Sankofa from the temporal to the spatial. So I guess I'd like to invite you, some people watching this video may not have read the article yet, so maybe I'd like to invite you to sort of expand on the way you were using Sankofa as a concept while thinking through the histories of the National Theater.
So for many people, not just you all, Sankofa is an idiom. And so it ends in a sentence. You know, it starts and ends in a sentence, going back to retrieve what you've lost. And because it's a cultural idiom, because it's mostly accessed through the symbol of the bird, rarely has it been really kind of, what is the word I'm looking for, kind of dove into as a really powerful way in which people are framing their relationship to culture. Because it's so prevalent, I think people take it for granted, actually. Because I think most, most people of African descent that know what Sankofa is have claimed it at some point in their life as a tool to access whatever cultural identity that they feel is missing. And yet, because it's such an accessible tool, they haven't really stopped to think about how, just how integrated it is in Black culture altogether. So Sankofa is usually thought about as this kind of temporal thing, going back to find lessons for the future. For a lot of us that are no longer on the continent, and even for those that are on the continent, because of how African culture has been framed as this thing that is static, linked to the past, it is in fact, Africa is both a time and a place. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
and authentic Africa is an Africa that remains frozen in a past, but it's also a place. And so what happens is that for many Africans that don't live on the continent, in order to return to the past, we have to go to the place. And then for Africans that do live on the continent, in order to return to the past, if they're urban dwellers, which usually it is urban dwellers that have these kinds of anxieties around authenticity, they have to go to the village.
Right.
So the past is always this thing that's rooted in a place. And so Sankofa is not just a temporal one, it's a socio-spatial practice as well. And so in thinking about the materiality of it, the geography of it, it became very evident that the two things were linked, and that we should really start to explore more what it means to consider it as a spatial praxis, a social praxis, a material praxis.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, in the article, the earlier plans for the theater buildings, right, tried really to quite clearly spatialize out these different times in a single complex. And then, of course, the building that we actually get in, well, I think 1992, right?
Yeah.
Early 90s. Is a different building again. And so that actually leads me to my next question, which is about the complexity of thinking through post-coloniality. And, you know, space and time, of course, are really difficult and complicated in a post-colonial sort of situation, which I guess arguably most of the world is in, or colonial. Anyway, the multiple players who are involved in this negotiation of what time and place will look like in the Ghana National Theater is so interestingly beyond that binary that you have sort of already pointed out is insufficient. So a thing that jumped out to me, and you just used the word authenticity or the authentic several times, is that you argue that the 1992 Chinese designed theater is not less authentic than perhaps a different building could have been. And so I would love to sort of invite your further musing on thinking about what authenticity looks like, I guess, in a 21st century Ghana.
Yeah. So I arrived at that actually because I struggled with it. I mean, I'm telling you, this whole project was born out of a desire to attain something more authentic in my life. And the more I researched, the more I realized this is not a thing. This is not possible. And so I really struggled with making that argument, to be honest. It did not come easily for me to say, okay, fine. This is Ghanaian too. And I think what helps is that if you think about authenticity, like, what is real is manifest in its material conditions. If you look at the material conditions in which something is created, that's the authentic circumstance in which it's created. And Ghana's circumstance has always been linked to global powers beyond itself. even as we seek to go to Ghana for a sense of an authentic self that is divorced from, you know, the colonial influences of the US or Britain or whatever other country, Ghana is always already like embedded in those structures from its very emergence and to today. And so what's interesting about the National Theater is that you see how this theater, which is meant to be an authentic symbol of like national culture and arrival, is so beholden to and manipulated by and co-constructed with external powers. And it just depends on the era in which you engage it. You'll see the influence of whichever power is linked to the country at the time. So in the 90s, that was China's, that was when China was trying to cultivate more influence in Western Africa. And so this became a gift to the government. And it was a gift that was both symbolic, you know, because this is a landmark. It is the National Theater and we helped you build it. So it's like a hearts and mind campaign. It's not like we're giving you something that, you know, we're building you a road. It's a hearts and mind campaign. And also, you know, because they build it, they get to decide what it looks like, right? Which is very different to how the US or Britain approached it. Actually, Britain tried to make it to decide what it looked like as well, but because it was the latter stages of their colonial authority, they were like, fine. But in every instance, actually, you see how these different foreign bodies are trying to shape what the nation is through this theater. All of these things are true, you know, like true to the material conditions of the time. And if that is the case, then they're authentic. You know, this is the life that people are living. This is the nation. This is what the nation is experiencing, is an authentic reality, which is divorced from our fantasy of authenticity. And so, yeah, that's how I'm trying to reframe it so that people realize that, yeah, this is an authentic representation of what the Ghanaian nation looks like today.
Yeah. Well, that maybe is an invitation to you and also to all the scholars out there for what comes next. What do we talk about next? How can we incorporate this sort of exquisite, complicated, research intensive argument and history that you put together for us, and maybe a map, right, if we're talking about spatial things, and parlay that into what the field does next. So my final question is, following you quoted Sandra Richards early in this article, mentioning the politics of citation, right, that it really matters who gets cited and who we make the choice to cite.
Absolutely.
In the future. And so I have sort of a two-part question. One is, what's the invitation to future scholars that maybe comes out of your work and this article in particular? And then the final question is, what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Yeah, the invitation to future scholars is something that I struggled with a lot in grad school, which is that I always wanted to emulate what had come before me. I did not trust in my own voice. And that is, that is the experience of all young scholars. But when you are a scholar who is not represented in a lot of the canonical texts, it's especially detrimental to your research. Trying to cite, Baudrillard or Desserteau to talk about, issues that are happening on the ground in Ghana. I did that, and struggled with it because I felt like I was imposing something, but I didn't know what else to do. And so Sankofa actually was my first kind of foray into thinking about, what are what are the philosophies, what are the theories? I also use praxis because I don't want to divorce what I'm talking about from the theorization that is happening in this idiom and in a lot of the philosophies that come out of, in my case, an Akan kind of cultural past. They're not just practicing things blindly, they're thinking through it. They are theorizers in their own right. And so how do we tap into these indigenous knowledges that, because they are not, you know, published by Duke University Press, we don't get to access in the classroom, you know, and they don't get that stamp of approval that says like, these are cultural thinkers. And so I invite all young scholars, especially scholars of color, especially scholars that come from cultures that don't, you know, that don't find the light of day in a lot of the theory that we read, to actually think about what are the indigenous knowledges that are unpublished. And, you know, that's where we come in. And so Sankofa was my first attempt at doing that, at citing in a way that felt authentic to the people that I was studying, that I was engaging in my own work. And so, and then also in doing that, I'm thinking about like creating new lineages, right? And also, who are my intellectual partners, you know? Who am I trying to intellectually engage beyond the academy? How can I explain this to my mother? You know, like just in a very real sense. My mother asks me, what are you doing? And I'll say, I'm taking Sankofa. You know Sankofa. She'd be like, of course, it's da-da-da-da. And I'll say, yeah, well, can you imagine the Ghanaian theater, when they were creating it, they were using Sankofa as a framework. And she gets that, you know, because that's knowledge that she has access to, not the books that I've read in, you know, in my classes. And so, yeah, that's what I would say to a future scholar. Don't shy away from indigenous knowledge. Don't shy away from forging new paths and creating new lineages, and citing politically and strategically.
Great. Excellent. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're working on now or next?
Yeah, so my next article is actually about Yeboah Sutherland, who is featured in this one. She was behind the second iteration of the National Theater, and she was also a professor, also a theorist, as well as a playwright and director, and just, you know, overall badass. She actually was, how do I put this? In thinking about alternative lineages, she created performance studies, I believe, in the 50s. She called it African drama. And she made the argument in a book that she didn't publish, but I was able to access when I went to her home and visited her personal archive. She's since passed. She was creating a book about African drama as not existing on the stage, but in like chieftaincy practices and festivals that we hold. And she would send her students out in the field to do ethnographies of these practices of like drummers, etc. And then they would then come back and theorize them as performance. And she was doing this in the 50s at the University of Ghana. And so again, thinking about an alternative lineage, how amazing would it have been if she had been the foremother to my introduction to performance studies, you know? And so this next article is about her, honoring her as an innovator in her own time and an alternative kind of founder to the field.
I love that. I cannot wait to read more about her. But if you can't wait, you can read this article, which has a little bit about Sutherland in it. And then we will be waiting with bated breath to see what you do next. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much. And one last time, congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it.